Um, Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Leanne Tritton and I am the chair of the London Society, and welcome to this webinar discussing London's local elections. It was originally titled The Day After, and this group of people came together via the NLA, which is New London Architecture, which is a fantastic organisation that is specifically designed to discuss issues around London and the built environment. And it was held a couple of weeks ago, and we felt that it was such an interesting topic and such a great discussion that many of our members of the London Society and people who are interested in London would be interested to participate. So the panel this evening is a really fantastic panel, very knowledgeable, and hopefully it'll be a bit entertaining as well. I think we're all a bit punch drunk from elections and politics and everything else. So we're going to try to find some optimism amongst it all. Kat Hanna is a brilliant urbanist and is currently a director of Avison Young. Robert Gordon Clark is a founder and a special advisor to London Communications Agency, and more importantly, the chair of the Sporting Wine Club, which is really important. Dave Hill, one of London's best known journalists and also the author of a fantastic book that we featured last week called Olympic Park, When Britain Built Something Big. Here it is if you want to buy it. And of course, Professor Tony Travers, who is with the London School of Economics, but is probably the best known economist talking and writing on all things to do with London, and a regular contributor to Radio 4 and sort of our major media outlets. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Robert Gordon Clark, who's going to kill us all, death by PowerPoint. You've got some fabulous slides. Over to you, Robert.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. And I was actually just looking up, 110-year-old London Society now, isn't it? 1912 it was founded. Be relieved to know we're not going to go back 110 years. We're just going to go back a few months. And Rowena is very kindly going to run some slides for us. So, Rowena, would you be kind enough to put up the opening slide? Lovely, thank you. And we're going to look very briefly, and what we're going to do this is, I know all three of my fellow presenters very well, and we're very good at interrupting each other. So we're going to interrupt you as we go, and we'll have a chat as we go through these slides, so colleagues do chip in. So if you go to the first slide, Rowena, please, be so kind. So a reminder to members of the London Society, and I'm sure most of you know this, but it's worth reminding ourselves, we have 33 local authorities if you include the City of London Corporation, the light grey in the middle there. We have 32 local authorities. And the map on the left showed the control after the last local elections, which were in 2018. And you can see there, Labour 21, the Tories 7, Lib Dems, their southwest quadrant 3, and Havering out east, no overall control. The map on the right shows the volume of councillors per borough in a circle representing the proportionally representing the numbers. So you can see some one-party states there, Newham, Barking and Dagenham are two good examples. And Labour with just over 1,100 councillors, Tories down at about 500, and the Lib Dems 154, Greens very small, and then other, which represents residents groups, particularly in places like Havering, and independent councillors. So that was the picture between 2018 and 2022. Next slide, please, Rowena. In the run-up to the elections, we at LCA did a lot of presentations to a lot of people, and we were trying to predict what might happen. And this slide is one we used in April, which showed where we thought there might be some quite interesting activity across the boroughs, mainly interesting on the west side of London, by and large. And the first group, Barnet, Harrow and Wandsworth, we said definitely up for potential control change. Westminster we described as complicated. Then we saw a few where we could see some erosion or change to the balance, but not to the control. And then, as some of you may know, we have directly elected mayors in a number of boroughs, and Croydon has introduced a directly elected mayor, which we'll come on to the results of that in a minute. And then where there is ongoing strife within the political parties, particularly where you have 100% one party, it's often commented that your opposition, therefore, is from within your own party. And so that was the picture we had. And that was the story we were telling in the run-up to the election that Tony and I and colleagues presenting. And then we got to, next slide, Rowena, to the 6th of May. And many of us woke up that morning. Some of us didn't go to bed. Tony never goes to bed on election nights, nor does Dave.
Thank you, Robert.
Exactly. And we woke up to the fact that 3 totemic, well-known Conservative controlled councils had gone Labour: Barnet, Wandsworth, and Westminster. And the next slide, Labour were very confident that London would swing even further their way. My friend Danny Beales, councillor in Camden, tweeted that afternoon that it would be a record result for Labour since 1965, when the current structure of London government was created, and anticipated them holding Croydon and holding Harrow, which we'll come back to. And Peter John, actually a former leader of Southwark, put a LinkedIn piece in saying the results that morning, almost certainly, therefore, Val Shawcross would win the directly elected mayor in Croydon. Politics is a funny thing, isn't it? How quickly life changes. Next slide, came the Friday to Sunday. Harrow went Conservative. Lufter Rahman, former mayor of Tower Hamlets, on his Aspire ticket, defeated John Biggs in the directly elected mayoral contest in Tower Hamlets. And then we saw probably the most extraordinary result in terms of the balance: a directly elected Conservative mayor winning in Croydon, whilst the actual council was just Labour controlled in terms of the number of councillors. And so the next slide, and then I'll turn to colleagues for comment. This is now the map of London. And Labour, thinking they might get above that magic 21 out of 32 boroughs, they ended up back with 21, having won Barnet, having won Wandsworth and Westminster, but then losing Croydon and Harrow and Tower Hamlets over that weekend. Conservatives down 1 from 7 to 6, but having lost 3 of their totemic boroughs. Liberal Democrats, no change at 3. Aspire taking Tower Hamlets, and Havering remaining no overall control. Colleagues, thoughts, observations, because you all went through it with me.
Yeah, I'll jump in on a couple of things, and I think one point I'd be keen to make in reference, I guess, to the totemic, boroughs that have been mentioned is that, taking someone like Wandsworth in particular, this oft said quote that this was, Thatcher's favourite borough.
Yes.
That quote was from the, early 1980s. And, quite a lot has changed since then, particularly when it comes to demographics.
Agreed.
So, whilst it's always hard to define, the exact reasons, obviously, why people are voting, it is certainly something to do with the fact that we, for example, got a lot more, university graduates, a lot more, I guess, of the kind of young professional population, a lot of whom are more likely to vote Labour rather than Conservative, particularly a lot of people renting as well, which was probably at least partly responsible for that change in Wandsworth. So perhaps in some ways, yes, it was hugely surprising and significant, but actually I think looking at demographic trends, perhaps less surprising than we might initially expect.
I agree, Can. And in fact, at the 2018 elections, Labour actually won a greater share of the overall vote in Wandsworth, but it wasn't balanced across the borough in the wards. I'm sure most London Society members know that each borough has roughly, it varies, but say 20 to 30 wards with normally 2 or 3 councillors in them, and the way the voting played out there. So there was already an indication that in 2018, Labour had a greater share of overall vote in the borough. Of course, Tony, as Tony, Westminster, turnout was another factor, wasn't it?
Well, I was going to add the Westminster change of control. We've discussed in previous events, we thought might have had, at least in part, something to do with COVID, the possibility that people with second homes had left Westminster and perhaps other parts of inner and central London to go to second homes, and some hadn't come back. Lo and behold, the census comes out this week showing that Westminster and indeed Camden's populations are substantially lower than the earlier Office for National Statistics estimates. And I suspect that this was a phenomenon that was particularly problematic for Labour, for the Conservatives in Westminster. Yeah,
absolutely. Plus obviously the Mound, which was considered a very helpful campaigning thing, Dave. I know you wrote You wrote a lot about the Mound, didn't you?
Well, quite a lot. I mean, I wished the Mound well. You know, I'm in a minority in having wished the Mound well. And in fact, I went there on day one. And I've got to say, I was rather disappointed. There weren't very many people and the views were awful. So in the end, you know, I'm not surprised that it didn't help the Conservatives. Just one other thing about Westminster, because it was very entertaining for me, because I wrote a piece in advance of the election saying, don't take too much notice of what the London-wide opinion polls are saying, because, and everybody's saying, oh, Westminster's going to go Labour, because the distribution of support across the borough has always been a problem for Labour, and the boundary changes don't make it any easier. So don't expect Labour to win. It will require an earthquake. And I went to see Paul de Moldenberg, who has been battling, the Labour councillor, and a couple of times leader of the Labour group, who's been valiantly fighting the uphill fight for years and years and years beforehand, and interviewed him. And there was a bit of expectation management going on, but he said, it's going to be really, really difficult for us to win. These are our targets. If we get them all, we might get a draw out of it. And to win, we'll have to get a very unlikely victory in a ward that doesn't look promising for us at all, such as Hyde Park ward, which is the one I happen to be contesting this time. If we can just sneak one seat there, you know, we might just do it. And of course, they won all three.
Yes.
And Paul wrote a very interesting piece for Labour List, describing why he thinks they managed to do it. And it was just very, very assiduous listening to and interacting with voters. And I don't know how many voters in that ward were away for the reasons that we discussed, that Tony spotted in relation to the census figures, but there's a sort of lesson there, I think, because perhaps a wider lesson for Labour's win, because in West End ward, for example, they absolutely placed themselves on the side of the residents, local people, and what they want, and how they're fed up with too much development, too much noise late at night, and that's why they won one of the three seats in West End ward in 2018, and they got the whole lot this time. So there's some sort of interesting lessons from the Westminster mix.
I suppose it's easier to have these engagements with residents if you've got a half-empty ward. I think in other boroughs with denser permanent
but you know, I thought the point was
harder.
Sorry, Kat. Yeah, so I thought the point was well made, because it's you know, the classic example of this is Malcolm Grimston, the former Conservative in Wandsworth, who decided to leave the party and ran as an independent in 2018 and got over 4,000 votes, which was more than any other candidate anywhere in the city, and romped home, defying the received wisdom. And he has extensive databases and is in constant contact with the voters, and he romped home again this time. So there's, you know, there is, I suppose what we're saying is, if you really, really do go out of your way to keep in touch with the voters, you get your reward.
Yeah, I wonder. Sorry.
No, you go, and then I'll
I wonder if perhaps Tower Hamlets is maybe an example of the perils of not doing so, or at least a bit of a cautionary tale, in that, you know, that there is a narrative that, you know, Lutfi Rama, you know, got in firstly because he very much did a kind of very mobilized campaign, particularly with the Bangladeshi community in Tower Hamlets, but also that there was perhaps a degree of complacency among those who would traditionally have voted Labour in the borough, feeling, it's all right, I don't feel massively engaged, there's probably not going to be any real issue here, and I'm not too bothered about voting. And there hadn't perhaps been that same amount, I guess, of kind of TLC that Dave was talking about, that made sure people did get out the door. Because I think, unfortunately, you know, I lived in Tower Hamlets until a couple of months ago. You know, there were a lot of very hardworking Labour councillors there, but was it necessarily driven home that, you know, everything that they were doing, and did that result in turnout in the same way?
And Kat, it's a nice segue into a question from the audience, and that is, what part did Sadiq have in weakening the Labour vote? If anyone's got any comments on that in the discussion.
In fact, I'd like to. I'm going to link that to the fact that, and Tony's made this point, that the 6 boroughs that changed all changed for quite different reasons. We've touched on Wandsworth already, we've touched on Westminster, but if you look at Barnet, for example, Harrow, Tower Hamlets and Croydon, they all had quite different reasons. And in fact, to my answer to that question, I don't think Sadiq was particularly a significant factor, either positively or negatively, in the ones that changed. So, and Tony, perhaps you can touch on the reasons for those boroughs. Maybe start with Barnet, Harrow, and then Dave, Cat, do chip in, and then Croydon, because I think there's three very different reasons for why those changed.
Yes, I mean, Barnet clearly almost, got relatively close to going Labour in 2018, but there were a number of wards with a substantial Jewish population and vote, which didn't at the time. They stayed with the Conservatives. And obviously, Keir Starmer as leader hasn't made it easier for some of those voters to vote Labour this time. Harrow, you've got elements of the politics of India feeding into some parts of the Harrow vote, and Labour's line on elements of Indian domestic politics not helping it there, I think. In Wandsworth, we've just heard, Wandsworth, Labour won the popular vote there last time and managed to go a lot further this time. Another borough it's worth mentioning, I think, actually, where the Tories did very badly is Merton, where a large chunk of the Conservative vote was eaten up by the Liberal Democrats, moving ever further in from the southwest. So very different factors from borough to borough, as you say, Robert.
And Croydon specifically, some London Society members may be aware that Croydon was in deep financial trouble as a Labour administration and was heavily criticised. And in fact, there was a referendum for a directly elected mayor pushed by the Conservatives, which turned out to be the right thing for them to do, because they end up beating Val Shawcross, very experienced former Labour leader of Croydon and former deputy mayor across London, and winning the popular vote for directly elected mayor for the Conservatives, primarily on the criticism of how the council had been run, Tony, correct?
Absolutely. There's no doubt that Val Shawcross was a good candidate, but Labour's mismanagement in Croydon undermined her capacity to win and handed it to a new Conservative mayor, or the first mayor who was a Conservative.
So, and Dave, Sadiq did go to his credit. He did campaign in 2 or 3 of the key boroughs that they were looking to swing, didn't he?
Yes, he went to Croydon and he went to Wandsworth, where he used to be a councillor, and 1 or 2 other places. I'm inclined to agree with you, Robert. I don't think Sadiq made a great or feelings about Sadiq were a particularly big factor anywhere. Just to go back to this point about the political sympathies of Hindu Londoners in Harrow and also in Brent. So the wards on either side of the boundary showed signs, and we've seen this before, and we saw it in the mayoral election, where Sadiq was not popular in those parts of Hindu voters going Conservative. And I've got a lovely piece written by Lewis Baston, one of God's own psephologists, which I'm going to run on the website tomorrow. And he's picked out sort of 7 or 8 interesting sort of deep trends in the overall.
Oh, I look forward to that.
In London, he picks this out. The best Conservative, I'll give you a sneak preview. The best results at ward level in Harrow were in the southeastern corner around Kenton and Centenary, which are the most strongly Hindu parts of London. And this patch of success extended across the border to similar wards in Brent. So you've got a micro trend within Greater London there.
If I may, Rowena, if you could be kind enough, I'm just going to finish off the 3 or 4 more slides on the numbers and the facts for London Society colleagues' benefit. So here's the table showing the changes. We've covered the 32 boroughs and the fact Labour's ended up where they are. You can see the number of seats and how many they're down. So the Conservatives down a further over 100. What's interesting here, and Tony's picked up on this a couple of times in presentation since, is that obviously the Lib Dems have done reasonably better, but not massively so. But the others and Greens, in proportional terms, have certainly done better. And there's a sense perhaps of the smaller parties getting a slightly better hearing, Tony, in the last.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about this is that Labour got one of their highest ever number of councillors, and the next slide also looks at this issue in percentage vote terms. But the Conservatives number of councillors won at 403 is by some distance the lowest they've ever won. So I think that the Labour vote in London and the Labour seat capacity, the capacity to win seats has topped out, but the Conservatives' capacity to lose votes and seats hasn't bottomed out.
Oh, exactly.
And what's going on is redistribution, the Conservatives losing some to Labour, but Labour losing some seats to Greens, to Lib Dems, and the Conservatives losing to Lib Dems as well. So there's more traffic between parties than we've seen in the past.
Before, Rowena, the next slide actually does show that. I've just noticed a typo, by the way. The Conservative number should be 403, but or whichever one it is. But your point about that's their lowest ever is in this year versus the lowest ever for Labour was back in 1968 when you were a young academic, Tony. I think. Yeah,
well, even I was, I think I'm still at school in 1968, but the point is, even me, but the point is that this is a dismal result for the Conservatives and begs a question for the party, even though they did hold on to and indeed win here and there, but overall, I think we're going to see when we get the final figures, swings against the Conservatives in a number of outer boroughs like Bexley and Bromley and Hillingdon. And the party, I think, faces, to use a cliche, an existential choice now as to how far they can, or whether they can, now hope to build back, or whether they just accept they're going to die out in most of London permanently. And that's a big choice for the party.
And I think to add to that, Tony, to maybe take it one step further, there is perhaps, and it depends what way you put the narrative, is it perhaps politically expedient for the Conservatives to say, actually, well, what happens in London doesn't really matter. In areas that we're losing, it's because they're all an out-of-touch metropolitan elite and we'd never want or even get their votes anyway. And if they manage to do okay in some places, you know, that's great too. And then obviously thinking how that plays into things like the levelling up agenda as well, which I imagine is something we may come on to. I can kind of see, you know, there wasn't that much that was really said about London, to be honest, by the Conservatives in the aftermath of these results. You know, even where there were successes, it was generally pretty muted.
I think it's a good point. I mean, that in a sense, the Conservatives have rather given up in London, but that means that Labour can rather give up as well, which is not good for London either. All I say is, I doubt the Conservative Party really wants to give up in London. And anyway, this effect is now spreading to the southeast. And next May, let's get on to next May's elections early. You know, there's a lot of Conservative seats, particularly in the southeast and southwest, up next year. And if they lose a shed loads of those, then are they just going to give up on the south, you'd have to say, as well as London, which I doubt they want to.
Could I just make a point, just augmenting what's already been said about Kingston and Richmond, which are two boroughs which are sort of battlegrounds between the Conservatives and the Lib Dems down in the southwest, suburban southwest of London, right next to the home counties. And as recently as 2018, I think the Conservatives controlled both of those boroughs, and they've been absolutely hammered by the Lib Dems this time around.
There's one councillor in Richmond. I think one Tory councillor left in Richmond.
Yeah, they're sort of down to almost nothing, and that must be very worrying for them. And also, I think Bromley's already been mentioned there. So you tended to think of, or I tend to think of Bromley as very solidly Conservative. Well, they've lost seats to Labour, to the Lib Dems, and to residents' parties. There are an assortment of losses adding up to quite a lot. And it's not, to mention Lewis Baston again, on April the 1st, he filed a piece for me, which was a sort of, not exactly a joke, but a sort of April Fool's tease, headlined, "Could Labour win Bromley?" You know, and everybody goes, "Don't be absurd." And then Lewis took us through the trends and the numbers, and it's not as silly as it might originally sound. So I think they are in deep trouble, the Conservatives in London.
Yeah, the Lib Dem point is an interesting one, and not least to myself, having grown up in the borough of Kingston. And I think obviously, you know, there's a couple of factors that are often cited, particularly in London, you know, is around, Brexit, but also I think in those boroughs in particular is again a sort of forensic attention paid to local issues by Liberal Democrats. I think particularly around planning, and you can again see why in some of those outer London boroughs, that's been quite a contentious issue as well. I think it will be interesting to see how that plays out again in other areas outside London. And you can see again how it's going to be tricky for, where boroughs are being pushed, for example, to be hitting their housing targets, but at the same time, there are vocal elements of the population, often quite large in some places, who are perhaps not wanting to see those targets hit as well. And actually, seeing Lib Dems have in a few instances used that as a campaign at which to rally around as well.
Yeah.
So interesting implications for real estate development, and particularly housing as well.
Yeah, I would add to throw in there, in terms of resistance to housing development, that was certainly a factor in Croydon, and there was also a factor, I think, probably in Enfield, where Labour lost 6 or 7 seats, I think.
Yeah. Well, Leanne, you asked about what's moved on since we did these presentations. So just as 3 very quick examples. So Harrow, the Conservatives, I think, Dave, already wanted to change their sort of approach towards tall buildings. I think the SP supplementary planning guidance, the mayor is canned or is canning. And in Westminster, as an example, the first planning committee, they turned down a scheme, I think, from Native Land for not enough affordable housing. So there are 3 quite quick examples already of the changing mood in boroughs who change political control. So let's just do 2 final slides.
Can I just jump in? I tell you, what an amazing panel. It's hard to get an edge in. I just want to thread in some questions coming from the audience. And you don't have to answer them all straight away, because I know they're going to theme in with some of the later conversations. But one of the questions is about Tower Hamlets and Aspire and grassroots campaigning, and you've sort of touched on that, but maybe you could talk a little bit about, grassroots local politics versus national. With the, we've talked about Sadiq. What about Boris? So are local elections still, by and large, immune to the national agenda? Is it about local stuff? Also, in terms of where I think we'll be touching later on about the huge loss of experienced councillors, and what that means for London. That's a very important question we've got.
Peter,
yeah, and later on, activities of London councils, and what that's going to mean for policies and campaigning. And again, Robert and team, you might introduce actually what is London Council, so that the audience understands what that's about. But they're the questions so far.
Thank you. We'll come back to if Rowena could just do the next 2 slides, because we'll actually pick up those issues on the implications slide. But just vote share very briefly. Rowena, and there's Tony's favourite, this one shows the vote share, and then the national equivalent share as well.
This really just looks at the vote share in London this time, and we can answer the question about, do national things matter as well as local ones? Well, they do. There's no question that in mid-term, not only in Britain, national politics influences local politics in a way that the majority, the government party at the national level, loses seats and opposition parties tend to gain them. We know that. It doesn't mean that good candidates can't hang on, but as I'm sure Robert will want to say, there is a lot of churn of members and leaders and chief officers going on in the borough. So I'll leave Robert to say more about that. So these vote shares, the 25%, just under 26% for the Conservatives, is down on last time by 3 percentage points, perilously close in the first past the post voting system to falling over the cliff and losing everything. Whereas Labour's vote share is down as well, actually, fractionally. So that they, I think, come at the highest level. They're not going to get above 43% in most elections ever again. Lib Dems did a bit better. Greens substantially better, to the point, and point was made earlier, they do now make up tiny oppositions in some of the boroughs where there were only Labour councillors before. So I think that what this tells us is that the Conservatives still have further to fall, Labour nowhere further else to go up, and then the minor parties could be the winners in the medium term because of this.
And Rowena, the next slide, the last one of the graphics there on the
Yes, this is a favourite of mine, which compares voting in London in the borough elections with what went on in national voting on the same day. So had there been a general election on the basis of the local election results we have from across the country, how did the parties do in London on that day compared with nationally? So if if a party does as well in London as it does nationally, it would appear as a 0. You wouldn't see it as an observation. And what you can see is that the Labour Party latterly has done substantially better in London than elsewhere, and the Conservatives rather worse, though actually this time Labour didn't do quite as well compared with their national performance as they did in 2018, and the Conservatives actually were not quite as bad as they had been in 2018. But you can see the pattern here. You know, Labour doing well, Conservatives continuing to do badly.
And Rowena, the next slide is a rare one for me, Leanne, because it's got the words on it instead of graphics and images. And we've touched on a couple of those issues already that have come up in the Q&A, and I'm going to come on to new faces and new leadership, because we've got a slide in a minute on that. We've touched on the future of London's local Conservatives. Tony's commented on it. But coming back to the question, and Dave, I look to you actually on Tower Hamlets, the question about grassroots and Aspire. Yeah. I mean, I think most of us know that a lot of the voting came through the faith networks and community networks rather than some top-down diktat.
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing to remember and was before about Tower Hamlets and look for Rahman's previous wins, including the one that was not a win in the end. There was so much preoccupation with irregular votes, illegal votes, and so on, and that there is a sort of popular belief that he only won because of dodgy votes. Now, it's really important to look at the judgment of the election court, which brought about his removal, and look at what is written there. And it says to prove that for the complaint to be upheld, you just have to find a little bit of evidence of votes that were invalid. It could be the tip of an enormous iceberg. It could be just a few relatively isolated examples in an otherwise perfectly impeccable poll, and we can't tell, and it's not our job to tell. No. So it's really important to remember that. And alongside that, he gets the vote out. Now, I went canvassing with him in 2014, and it was rather extraordinary. People crossing the street to shake his hand in the sort of Brick Lane, Whitechapel High Street area, and a lot of handshaking and a lot of embracing and so on and so forth. So he's always had popular grassroots support, which is very substantial, and he knows how to get the vote out. Yeah. And that's exactly what happened this time. Yeah. And it's very interesting, I think, that there's been very little noise about, oh, well, you know, it was all dodgy votes and so on this time. Even Peter Gold, the surviving Conservative member of Tower Hamlets Council, who's an absolute veteran of all this, has said to me, you know, it really was nothing like what we saw before this time. So he's got proper support and he knows how to get people out to vote.
Yeah, I think just to add to that and go back to this point of kind of grassroots and local issues is, you know, the reality is we don't really know the exact impacts of local issues on voting, because we don't know, you know, we don't have data on, you know, why people vote the way they do, particularly at that local level. There will be some that vote purely on local levels. There will be some that, as Tony has highlighted, will often use it as a protest against national government. And use it as a chance to voice that. And there'll be those who it's a mixture of, between the two. I think quite interestingly with Tower Hamlets, though, is, whilst again, you can't say this is the exact reason, anecdotally, there was at least a couple of issues that particularly resonated with the community in Tower Hamlets, one of which in particular was around LTNs. So obviously, these
low traffic neighborhoods.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, low traffic neighborhoods, and I'm sure people on the call are familiar with them. But the issue there was in which it was really mobilized as a way of saying, look, for a lot of people, particularly in the Bangladeshi community, who rely on private vehicles as a means of an income, that could be driving for Uber, that could be delivery, for example. This was actually something that was almost, it was really stopping them earning a living. And this was showing that Labour don't really care about working people. And it was kind of mobilized, you know, as that kind of issue. And again, I think quite an interesting example. Again, was it responsible for winning? No, I don't think we can say that, but definitely a factor. There was also some really exciting issues around bins. But I think, you know, all that said, it doesn't withstand the fact that, you know, Lutfur Rahman is an incredibly popular politician. And as Dave Hill says, you know, you can take what you want as what happens at previous elections, but he very much did get people out the door to vote.
I think you're absolutely right on LTNs in townhomes. There was a by-election last summer, I think it was, which Labour were defending and lost heavily to an Aspire, and that was everybody I think agrees it was a factor there. The other thing that Lutfur does, and this sort of harks back to sort of slightly different versions of people not wanting stuff built and knocked down. He plays the Save Our Heritage card quite a lot. So the Brick Lane, the plans to build on the car park in the old Truman Brewery in Brick Lane, which is a sort of beautiful and a building. There was a lot of opposition to that, or at least conspicuous opposition to that at the time that the Labour administration said, yes, you can go ahead. And I'm not sure what, if anything, Lutfur Rahman can do about this, but he certainly made a noise about it during the election and has done since. So we don't want, you know, we don't want lots of flashy new buildings destroying our town hamlets community, etc.
Rowena, if you be kind enough, I'm going to go on to the leadership point, which Leanne had flagged from one or two of the audience. So this is the map showing you how long each borough leader have been leader in 2018, the last local election. So May 2018, and the newest one was Councillor Caliscan, who took over after the local elections in a sort of Labour coup in Enfield, replacing Doug Taylor. So you see how many were new then, and you had some long-standing, quite experienced leaders in Hillingdon, Bexley, Southwark, Merton, Julian Bell and Ealing, Ravi, Govinda in Wandsworth. And if you can be kind enough to click forward to the slide showing the leadership now, you can see quite starkly how much has changed and how many. So Nezel Caliscan, who was new 4 years ago, if you look on there, she's mid-table. And the number who have taken over since the last local elections, and the number of brand new leaders literally now, including ones we've touched on. So Simon Hogg, a leader in Wandsworth, Paul Osborne, the Conservative leader in Harrow, Barry Rawlings in Barnet, Adam Hugg in Westminster, Mayor Jason Perry in Croydon. The combination of election changes and changes just through natural churn has been remarkable. And Tony, sorry.
I was going to say, I've just said we've made this point. The median length of a borough leader is now 1.5 years, not the average, the median length, the middle observation here, 1.5.
Yeah, so it is now and I think Peter Everston maybe tweeted about or messaged about the number of councillors who didn't get re-elected. Behind the leadership bit, a lot of councillors, there's been a lot of change in a lot of councils, a combination of older councillors not standing again or losing their seats, but also a worrying trend, and I've talked to a few borough leaders, I don't know if the analysis has been done, of people who did only one term, who then decided this wasn't for them. Younger people standing, put off by whatever reasons, the workload, the pressure, the expectation from their communities. So a lot of change. And Tony mentioned the chief execs as well. We haven't got the graph, the table here, but today is Andy Travers' last day at Lambeth. John Barradell is stepping down at the City this summer. There's been a lot of changes in borough chief execs as well. So quite a churn there. Rowena, could you do the next slide? I haven't got that many more, but we touched on the implications for the Tory party, and we could just spend 1 or 2 minutes on this. The next mayoral elections for the London Society members, it's worth keeping in mind, are now closer than when they should have been, because they were delayed from 2020. They were delayed a year. So you've got this situation where Sadiq Khan is actually standing again in 2024, which is now less than 2 years away. If he does decide to stand, certainly the perception from Dave and I think other commentators is that he's gearing up to stand for a third term. And one of the interesting questions is, where is the Conservative Party in terms of the next mayoral elections? And more generally, as Tony said, where are they as a London party? And this piece by Gareth Bacon, former Assembly member, it was actually quite an interesting one from just after the elections in May. Thoughts from colleagues on the panel?
Well,
I
it does
think,
beg.
Sorry,
Go
Tim.
for it. Sorry, Dave. Go on.
No, I was just going to say that I sort of feel that the Conservatives need to start compromising with the electorate a bit more in London. You know, this is what's always said about the sort of hard left in the Labour Party, that they don't want to compromise with the electorate. They want to stick to their principles and so on. And that's why they keep losing. And I think the same may apply in its own way to the Conservatives in London. I mean, I am sort of astonished by the leader of the Conservative group on the London Assembly, Susan Hall, who's also a councillor in Harrow and is, you know, very, very pleased that her party won there, but constantly tweeting about brilliant things she saw on GB News the other night. You know, GB News is essentially an anti-London television channel. What's going on? You know, yeah. I think so. I think they need to do some serious rethinking, and also, and this is a point that's been made by Stephen Hammond, the MP for Wimbledon, a number of times. He said at an event I was at recently that not only does the organisation of the Conservative Party need to enter the 21st century, it actually hasn't quite got around to the 20th century yet in terms of, you know, how organised they are. And he said he looks in envy at the sort of Labour machine on the ground. But I mean, my last point, and I sometimes think about this as a bit of a fun exercise, because I would never be asked to do it. But if I was asked to put on sort of 2 sides of A4 paper what the Tories in London should do to restore their fortunes, it's quite difficult to know what to put, actually, that keeps them distinctively Tory,
well,
but is different. I know that there must be. Yeah.
You got anything to put on Dave's blank sheet of paper?
Well, I think, I mean, if a lot of the, you know, the literature put out by Tory candidates is to go by, is what you don't put is that you are from the Conservative Party, and that seems to be the best way to win a vote. So, you know, look, I think it would be an incredibly difficult job to campaign, you know, on behalf of the Conservative Party in a lot of areas of London. I think, again, probably the best way to do it, though, would be, again, taking a leaf out of the Lib Dem book and, again, identifying with some of those key local issues and, you know, demonstrating that ability to be a very kind of diligent local councillor. Beyond that, I think it's quite challenging. That said, you know, look, how long is this kind of anti-London sentiment from national government going to play out for? Are we going to get a stage where they realise it is actually damaging the entire UK economy, potentially? I wouldn't want it to get to such a stage, but it might be helpful to start changing things. And again, I think that again could make life a little bit easier. But until that happens, I think you go very much small C and yeah, really get out, get campaigning on those local issues.
Tony?
It's noticeable, isn't it, that in Wandsworth in the local elections, they were effectively campaigning as Wandsworth Conservatives. I was in Wales at about the time. Well, the Welsh Conservatives were campaigning as Welsh Conservatives. The Scottish Conservatives have long been a separate entity. So I think that finding a way of, certainly so long as the party remains in power at the national level, and this very strong perception that the party's anti-London now, they do need to have a separate identity. And of course, with the mayoral election that you mentioned coming up, they need to find a really good candidate who has a fair chance of winning, particularly if Sadiq Khan runs for a 3rd time. I think that will make it easier if they can find the right candidate.
And I think it's worth just pointing out to London Society listeners that they may recall that in the previous elections for the mayor, you have 2 votes, first preference and second. That has now been scrapped, and we will be going for straight first past the post. And that might help a Conservative candidate in that the left vote could be split between a Labour candidate, a Green candidate, a Liberal Democrat candidate, and that they want the second preferences to top up that situation. So it'll be fascinating to see. I'm going to suggest, because I'm conscious of time, Leanne, but Rowena, if you can jump on past the next slide, because we sort of touched on some of the issues here. the last 4 slides are the national political picture, which does relate back to London. So if you can go to the next slide, Tony, these next 2 slides are really interesting about the national picture, which I think
this looks at the so-called net equivalent vote share, which is, if you look at the pattern of local elections in any one year and then say, well, what would this be if there were elections everywhere in that year? Colin Rallings and Michael Thrasher, now of Oxford, formerly of Plymouth University, do that calculation, and you come up with these figures. So the Conservatives have been doing surprisingly well for a party in government for so long, and Labour, under its previous leadership, rather badly. Labour did just beat the Conservatives this time. Liberal Democrats and other parties now a bit on the up here, but Conservatives have done surprisingly well at the local level for a party that's been in power now for 12 years.
I think the next slide in the number of councillors is staggering. This is probably the most staggering slide of the two.
Yeah, this makes it even more. If you look back to 1973 and but particularly to 79 and the blue line, Mrs. Thatcher, then John Major in power at the national level. The Conservatives lose councillors almost every year until the party goes into opposition. Labour then, who've gone up, they lose councillors almost every year until they go back into opposition. But since 2010, it was actually the Liberal Democrats who took the big hit when the coalition was in power.
You're in time there, yeah.
Yeah, Conservatives still the biggest party in local government and still have the chair. They still have the chair of the LGA 12 years out from them going into government in 2010.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? And the final 2 slides are just to be as up to date, because Leanne said, keep us up to date. And obviously last week we saw the 2 by-election results and Oliver Dowden resigning. And I mean, it's interesting here, and I think we've all read the press here, that the Wakefield result wasn't that brilliant for Labour. I think it's fair to say. Agree?
Yeah.
I
mean, the Wakefield result, Labour, if replicated the Wakefield result across the country in a general election, they'd just get a majority. So it's not brilliant. But on the other hand, given where they've been, it's not bad.
No.
Whereas Tiverton and Honiton was a sort of full screeching, visible from space Lib Dem super win, and will massively discomfort Conservatives all over the south of England.
And the final slide, Rowena, and thank you so much for doing this, though, is I've said this quite a lot to Tony, which is that I track all the national polls. So this is a tracker showing all the polls that are done nationally, dotted onto a chart and giving you an average at the moment. I'm still, you would have expected after 12 years of a Conservative coalition and then a Conservative government, you might have expected that Labour would be polling consistently above 40%, and that the gap between the Conservatives and Labour would be close to double digit. And yet, even now, okay, there's a few polls that show occasionally Labour at 42 and the Tories down at 31. But the average gap at the moment still is around 5 to 6 percentage points, which says something a lot about the national confidence in Labour and a pretty rock solid still support for the Conservatives, albeit only at 1 in 3. Tony.
It's worth remembering that, I agree with everything you've said, but at the last election, the figures for the parties were Conservative 40, Labour 30, slightly under. So this represents a swing, as on this slide, of about 7 or 8%.
Which
Conservative
is
to Labour,
fair point.
Which would lose the Conservatives their majority, and probably they'd lose the election if that happened. But having said that, you're right. The impact of Jeremy Corbyn in the long term on the Labour Party is clearly still there for all to see. And actually, in the most recent polls, if anything, in the last few days, it's been narrowing again. The Conservatives are inching back towards a kind of, very close to Labour. So I just think the damage done over the years of the Corbyn leadership is going to, it might take another period in opposition, and that will then be, and Tony Blair's having his big conference at the moment.
He is, isn't he? Today.
It's the question of, whether the Labour Party is the right party to oppose the Conservatives, given how good the Conservatives are at winning elections. But there we are.
Leanne, that's all the slides, and I've timed that quite well because we did do some questions during the presentation. We've still got a good 10 minutes. Back to you, I think. And should we come off screen, Rowena, if that's all right? And thank you very much.
Yeah, just absolutely fantastic. I mean, rattling through some huge topics there. I've got two sort of themes. We've got 9 minutes left. One of them is about the local elections and building and planning in London.
Yes.
What does it all mean? Are we all, you know, with all of these new councillors who are with their feet under the table, nervous, getting slammed, getting their first bite of social media in power? Is everything going to grind to a halt? You know, we still need housing. You know, give us your thoughts on that. And the other thing is anti-London.
Yeah.
Where are we on anti-London? Is Boris and the Conservatives going to put their arms around us again one more time, or we're still on the naughty step for as long as they're there?
Yes. I'll have a go. So I'll start on the first one because Dave and I go back a long way, and Tony, on debates about development in boroughs, and my company acts for quite a lot of developers, as Peter and colleagues at London Society know well. I think one of the issues we haven't touched on is the financial state of the boroughs. Okay, we haven't talked money. And it's interesting that Westminster, I think Westminster Labour said they would freeze the council tax, I think, Tony, for the next couple of years. Yeah. Which is a bit like, you know, Labour getting in 97 and so they'll stick with the spending policies of the previous Conservative government for 2 years. They do not have much room to manoeuvre, and inflation is hitting them. And one area of where they can generate income to the boroughs is, of course, development through community infrastructure levy, Section 106, traditional forms of tax. And that dynamic has not gone away. And whilst already Westminster is showing signs, and Harrow and Croydon, of being tougher on development and on scale of development, they've still got to balance that with delivering the housing targets, as you said, delivering jobs. I mean, this is another massive issue. The unemployment levels in places like Ealing and Harrow and Hounslow and Hillingdon are significant. So I think I don't think it's going to be that simple that some of these boroughs are just going to say, right, we're now going to turn down lots of development. They're going to have to try and strike the balance between the scale of development and what it delivers. But I'll hand over to others. They're nodding, but
I think I'll add one more point, if that's all right. I haven't been within these discussions so long, I guess, being a relative newcomer compared to the three of you.
Sorry, Kat, I didn't mean to say the ages card there. My apologies.
No, stop rubbing it in. Thank you.
But I think what I'd add is, you know, as well as the housing number side, you know, there's long been an issue, and, you know, will no doubt continue to be, particularly as we get closer to mayoral elections. There'll be a keenness to get those numbers up, I imagine. There are new issues emerging, and I think those paying attention in Westminster, particularly around the Marks and Spencer building, and challenge around, do you demolish and rebuild to very high sustainability credentials, or actually do you look to a retrofit and, you know, deliver on sustainability that way? I think this is going to become a really live topic. If I was being cynical, I might say sometimes it will be used when people are wanting to oppose development, and this becomes another thing to throw at the please no more new development argument. But there are also incredibly legitimate arguments that, where possible, I would agree we should be looking, you know, to retrofit first, you know, particularly with a lot of boroughs, for example, having declared a climate emergency. And I think it's going to get quite interesting in terms of how that plays out in planning. It's something I think I said last time, you know, I think just as we see often different parties, and not political parties, but different actors getting their different consultants tooling up to make the arguments for and against viability and what they need to be delivering, I think we could see the same happening with carbon. And actually people saying, look, this retrofit is better, no, my new build is better, and again getting different consultants involved, and this becoming actually quite a keen point for some political wrangling. So that's the other bit that I would flag in the kind of, you know, development and planning world as well.
I mean, can I add something? I mean, two things, one an amusing one and one a serious one. The amusing one is, having Kat's mentioned the decision to call in the Marks and Spencer's mega building at Marble Arch by the DLUC, when of course the department itself is opening a new headquarters in Wolverhampton in a brand new building. I'm sure there were some buildings in Wolverhampton that could have been. I'm
sure there are no vacant buildings in Wolverhampton. That
exactly, there would
be vacant buildings.
Exactly, but the more serious point, I think, is one of the other things is after the Chesham and Amersham by-election, the government's done a screeching 180 degrees U-turn on planning and housing targets. It doesn't really want to put those areas and the wider southeast under pressure anymore to build lots of homes. I think that will create more pressure in London over time, because London is slightly more willing to build. I mean, they may not be able to go as high in as many places, but I think it will create more pressure in London and will push the population in London up somewhat above what it would otherwise have been. So I think that will be a kind of further iteration of, Cat's wise deconstruction of where we're headed.
Just on the sort of anti-London point in general, I mean, it is clearly there and it is articulated. Quite a lot of it is sort of just noise, isn't it? Crowd pleasing noise. But I do that, there must be people in positions of power and authority who know that all this is nonsense, and that you've got to nourish London's economy whether you like it or not. And it sounds a bit sort of pat to say it, but I just think the sooner Boris Johnson is gone, the better it will be for the capital city. I can't see it getting much worse. There might be the possibility of a new relationship forming between the Labour Mayor of London and the Conservative National Government. That could not get any worse than it is. Andy Byford, the TfL Commissioner, was at London Travel Watch, the watchdog London Travel Watch's meeting a couple of days ago, and said, this is the hardest job I've had because of the endless, constant, never-ending negotiations with national government about funding. It is completely and utterly exhausting. Surely, if Boris Johnson goes and his team, much of his team goes with him, there is got to be an opportunity to rethink all that and clear some of that stuff out of the way and start again.
Just to add to that point, and just when you thought all of this incredibly dismal relationship between national government and London-wide government, the mayor couldn't get anywhere, along comes the Metropolitan Police being put into special measures, which leads to an enormous outbreak of finger pointing and everybody blaming everybody else, when of course the police are operationally independent. In the sense that, what could politicians do? We don't want politicians telling the police what to do. So the rancour, which by implication Dave is pointing to, is a real thing. And until and unless we can move on from it, forgetting the sort of levelling up anti-London thing, the rancour is a freestanding thing, which itself is problematic.
And is there also a fact that, if London, the more Labour London gets, the more rancorous that relationship becomes, and also potentially the more, and also as we're seeing, the more powers or more interventionist national government, becomes.
I think the boroughs get on better with the government, and the government naughtily sort of hands things to the boroughs round the mayor, around, so it doesn't go past through the mayor. There's a slightly complicated, some other better relationship, I think, even between Labour boroughs and the UK government than between the mayor and the government. But
yeah, probably true. Yes,
I think that is a fair point. Yeah.
Yeah, it's 7:29, and I'm handing back to the chair, I think, if that's all right.
Yeah, just absolutely an amazing discussion. And I think Chris Rogers has put a comment on, which I was trying to cut and paste actually, so we can save. Maybe Rowena can do it so we can put on our book jackets and websites. But fantastically intelligent, concise and eloquent contributions from the panel, by the way, puts TV to shame. I absolutely
we all love Chris. Chris is a wonderful person.
Yes,
Chris.
Fantastic.
I don't know you, Chris, but thank you. That's
We'll have T-shirts made. Dave, get T-shirts made for that one.
And there's still a lot to go through. A lot of comments about net zero and climate change and M&S and everything else. I think also the sort of anti-London sentiment. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out with, you know, what the FT is saying is a looming recession. Will suddenly they have to put their arms back around sort of the golden goose and say, actually, we do like you. Could you make us a bit of money so we can spread it around? But what can I say? Thank you so much, and thank you to the London Society members, and thank you for making up your time on a summer's Thursday evening to talk about politics. But it's just been brilliant. Thank you so much, and
Nice to see you.
To everybody else, keep an eye on the London Society website for more events and quality panels like this. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to
Bye,
see you.
bye,
Bye.
everybody.